Okay, well, it's 12:05, so let's get started. Hello and welcome. This is the UC Center Sacramento Speaker Series. I'm Richard Kravitz, director here at the center. And this is our first talk of the academic year, which kicks off our 21-22 theme of emerging from the pandemic, promoting health and prosperity for all Californians in the wake of COVID-19. Because it's the beginning of the year and because some of you may be less familiar with UCCS than others, I want to extend a special welcome to you if you're new. We are, if you will, the diplomatic mission for the University of California in Sacramento. And we have two major goals. The first being to prepare the next generation of California's future leaders, and the second to share solid expert knowledge to enhance public policy making. What we share and how we share it really depends on you. So if there's topics we're missing or UC faculty speakers you'd like to hear from, please let us know. If you work in state government and suspect UC must have done some research on that, but don't know how to get started, let us know. We want to be your partners in connecting you to the subject matter expertise you need to make the best possible decisions in the public interest. So now to today's topic, which is an evaluation of the California Competes tax credit program. A few years ago, there was concern that California's businesses were all going to flee to Texas and other low tax states. California Competes was one policy response. Did it work? To address this question, we're pleased to welcome back to UCCS Professor David Neumark. Professor Neumark is Distinguished Professor of Economics and co-director of the Center for Population, Inequality, and Policy, both at UC Irvine. He's a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and he's been a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve and a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Dr. Neumark is the author of scores of academic papers and reports, as well as several books covering topics ranging from the minimum wage to the economics of affirmative action. He's the winner of many awards, including election as a fellow to the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the 2015 UCI Graduate Student Faculty Mentoring Award. Before we get started with this talk, just a word about our format for questions. Professor Neumark will be speaking for roughly 40 minutes, after which there'll be an opportunity for Q&A. Please raise your hand using the participant hand raise feature in Zoom, or if you're unable to join us live, you can type your question into the chat. So now, please join me in welcoming Professor David Neumark.
Thank you. First of all, make sure you do see my slides still, correct?
Looks good.
Always got to check. Thank you. So thanks for hosting me again. I think this is the third or fourth time I've talked to this audience, or the general audience. The people change, obviously. And consistent with UCCS's mission, I'm a big believer in, well, I do policy research, so that's why I'm a big believer, but I'm a big believer in doing research motivated by important policy questions and conveying it to policymakers, because otherwise, what's the point? That's the whole goal of this. So as Richard said, this is about the California Competes tax credit, which I will probably call CCTC most of the time because it's a mouthful. Richard just reminded me of something when he talked about this fear that all the businesses were going to flee to Texas. I actually moved to California I came in 2000 sabbatical and moved in 2002. And for those who remember, that was really a concern then. In fact, somebody, probably the governor of Texas, whoever it was at the time, I don't remember, was putting up billboards on California highways, inviting businesses to move there. And there was the same fear that, they were all going to move. And of course, people like the grumpy economists like me said, well, that's just ridiculous, right? I mean, most businesses can't move, right? You can't ship in, cooked hamburgers to the restaurant from Texas. And we did some research back when I was at PPIC with Jed Colco, showing that in fact, mobility of firms or the loss of jobs from firms leaving was not zero and not necessarily negligible, but was negligible relative to the effects of creation of new firms and growth of existing firms in California, and conversely on the negative side, deaths of existing firms and shrinkage of existing firms. So it's always important to remember that while this relocation thing attracts a lot of attention, especially, mayors jump up and down when someone moves to the city, and mayors lose elections when a big company leaves their city. The nuts and bolts of job creation and growing existing firms is critical. It never makes for sexy as a news story, of course. Nor does the birth of firms, because firms aren't big when they're born; they're small when they're born, and they only become stories later. That said, relocation does play a role in this policy, and it's interesting. So let me dive in. Then this is joint work with Matthew Friedman, who's my colleague, and Shantanu Khanna, who's one of our students, I should say. This work is funded by two grants from two foundations, Laura and John Arnold Foundation and the Smith Richardson Foundation. The views are only our own. We also used confidential data from the U.S. Census Bureau. And there's a whole long footnote here, which you don't have to read because it's boring, about that process and all that. And perhaps most importantly, we had pretty amazing cooperation from GoBiz in accessing their data, also under, of course, confidentiality restrictions. And I'll say this at the outset, it comes up on a slide later, but in case I don't say it, I don't want to forget. GoBiz shared their data, they shared their expertise, both of which were important. I mean, we couldn't have done anything with just their expertise, but their expertise plus the data was a particularly potent combination. But they have no control over what we say or what we concluded. We could have concluded this thing is a disaster. We don't, but we could have. And they couldn't have stopped us. They couldn't have gotten in our way. The only rights they had as part of the agreement was to make sure we weren't disclosing at the end of the day, through briefings like this and through the paper we've written and others we may write, to make sure we weren't disclosing any confidential information. And we were very clear on that from the beginning, that those had to be the ground rules, and they understood completely. So that's important to keep in mind. Okay, so let me plunge in then. So in general, there's a renewed interest in leveraging policy to incentivize job creation and economic development. And partly this is spurred by a growing sense, and not just a growing sense, a growing fact or set of facts, that certain locations, and that could be large locations like states or even regions of the country, or much smaller locations like poor areas within a city or a county or state, that place matters a lot. Raj Chetty and his team have documented, and we've probably all heard about it through the media and other outlets, how kind of where you're born has so much to do with your economic success. And that obviously raises the question, what can we do to make the places that are disadvantaged and lead to this longer term disadvantage more successful? And we call policies like this that try to target particular locations place-based policies. Now, CCTC, I'll clarify later, it's not as directly place-based as other economic development policies, but it has a flavor of it. That's important to keep in mind, because when you'll hear it, as I will do, compare it to other programs, and you'll hear other discussions of this. It's kind of a hybrid. It's not just about creating jobs anywhere in the state, but it's not just about targeting low-income areas. It's kind of a mix of those. But when we talk about place-based policies in particular, and even job creation policies more generally, but particularly place-based policies, the fact is that the track record is pretty awful. Both Matt and I and many other people have worked on different kinds of place-based policies, enterprise zones, other things. I wouldn't say the research is unanimous that these things don't work. Research is almost never unanimous, but a lot of the research, and by far the preponderance of it, points in that direction. And there's a few problems, and that's why I was sort of, when I learned about CCTC, I immediately said, I got to figure out if we can find a way to study this, because it addressed these problems. So here are the problems. One is when you're creating when you write a policy that gives money, that's intended to incentivize job creation, there's always the problem of what we call windfalls. And what we mean by that, by a windfall, is getting money from the government for doing something you would have done anyways, right? So if you were going to create jobs, and now lo and behold, the government says, we'll give you a tax credit for creating jobs and you can claim it. Well, it'd be silly not to claim it, right? But it didn't actually change your behavior. So the government's spending money. It might even look like jobs are getting, created by the policy because there is a hiring credit or whatever the payment is attached to the job created. But it's very important to understand that job might have been created anyways. And how do you can never get rid of this problem completely, but how do you minimize it so that when you're spending the public's money to create jobs, you're actually creating net new jobs. The second is that jobs may fail to be created for the less advantaged. Now, that's not always the goal, but most of us think that's an important goal because the less advantaged have worse employment prospects. And those are two problems that CCTC, I think, addresses well, as I'll explain. So we evaluate the effects of this program. In the research I'm talking about today and that we've done so far, we're talking about and we're studying effects in recipient neighborhoods. And what I mean by that, to be exact, is the tracts, the census tracts. Think of a census tract, for those of you who don't know, as roughly about 5,000 people. So in a dense urban area, it could be quite small, like a quarter of a square mile in the densest areas. The more rural you get, obviously they can be huge, but roughly 5,000 people, not exactly the same, but that's roughly what they are. That's in my neighborhood. And we're looking at jobs in that tract and how they're affected by CCTC. And I'll talk later about other things we're doing later. What's so fascinating about CCTC, at least on a priori grounds, is it incorporates a lot of what we call best practices. What does that mean? Well, it means what other people, not just me, but including me, said these programs should do to work better. And CCTC, even though no one ever asked me, happened to do this. So that's great. They just, somebody else told them they should do this, or they figured it out themselves. And I'll talk more about those best practices, but it has this flavor of, it has explicit thresholds for eligibility, which like almost all government programs do. But the other unique thing is, or the combination is unique, is it also includes a lot of discretion on the part of program officials in awarding credits to businesses. And that's important, as I'll discuss. And then you may not care as policymakers, but I care a lot as a researcher. It just so happens, and I was stunned when I learned this, but it's actually true, that the way they set this program up really lends itself to a rigorous evaluation of its effects. And what I mean, like economists and other social scientists say that, what I mean is it lends itself to really being able to figure out if this program had a causal effect, if it actually led to more jobs being created. Okay, and that's actually a challenge, as I'll discuss soon. Okay, so let me give you two summary slides, like one about approach in very general terms and summary of findings. Then I'll dig into more details. Okay, so what do we do here? We have what micro data. There's individual data. So people are asked in the American Community Survey, are they working and where do they work by census tract? So we measure that with confidential census data because the census doesn't release data to researchers at like the tract you live in or the tract you work in, because that gets close to private information. But we can access as researchers subject to about 10 million restrictions. Okay. We have data on companies that applied for CCTC credits. Credits is redundant, but it's the only way to say it, CCTC credits. And some got accepted. That is, they were awarded the incentives, or the jobs were awarded, or the jobs were incentivized, however you want to say that. And some were rejected. And the rejected ones are nice from a research perspective, because we can kind of say, well, if we have two tracks and one had a lot of people applied to create jobs and for these incentives, and they got them, and another one, a lot of people, like businesses, applied to create jobs where they didn't get them. Those two tracks are more likely to be alike than just a track where a lot of businesses applied for jobs and a track where nobody applied for jobs, nobody applied for incentives. So you can kind of control for or condition on the demand for these credits, which is a way of comparing like to like. And if you want to ask, did the policy have an effect, you got to compare like to like. If I have a booming tract and there's a lot of businesses applying for jobs, and I have another tract where there's nothing going on, and then it's declining or no one's applying for jobs, well, only the first one is going to get awards by definition because no one applies in the second one, and they were booming anyways. So you might think there's a big effect, but there might not be, right? And our approach lets us sort of sort that out. And then there's this other thing which deals with the structure, the specific structure of the CCTC program, that lets us not just compare tracts with accepted and rejected applicants, but actually tracts with accepted and rejected applicants that had scores. And I haven't explained the scores yet, but I'll get to those later, but that have scores of their applications that are very close to each other. So now we're zooming in on tracts that are even more alike, but some get awarded these incentives and some don't. So we're even more sure we're identifying a real or a causal effect of the program. And fortunately, the results are the same no matter what you do. So it seems, in fact, to be real. Okay, summary of the evidence briefly. We find evidence of, it's robust and it's statistically strong, of positive local employment effects. And what we mean there is the business in the tract gets awarded credits, jobs are created in that tract. And that's what we mean by positive employment effect. What's kind of stunning, I think, and quite interesting is that each CCTC, it's hard to say, each CCTC incentivized job in a tract increases the number of jobs in the tract by around 2.5. So in other words, more than the number of jobs for which we, being the taxpayers, are paying the incentives. So let me give you a little context. I talked about windfalls before. Remember, windfall is you create an incentive and the job would have been created anyways. Well, if a program is pure windfalls, then the effect should be zero. It doesn't actually create any new jobs, right? Businesses may like the tax break, but it doesn't create new jobs. If the estimate is 1, that means there's no windfall. That would be great, right? You incentivize a job, whatever it costs you, and the job actually gets created. Well, that's what the program's supposed to do, right? Even better is when the estimate exceeds 1, because that means additional jobs get created. Now, why would additional jobs get created? Well, take a simple story, right? Tesla opens its plant. It may or may not get a tax credit. You can look up the data. That's actually public information. But Tesla creates a plant, whether or not it gets subsidized by CCTC. The jobs at the Tesla plant may be the ones that are subsidized, or maybe Tesla just creates additional jobs at its plant. But also, people go out for lunch, people drive in and out, people stop and get they probably don't get their clothes dry pressed to work in a Tesla factory, but they stop and get their cars fixed. There's auxiliary businesses. People may move to be nearby. A lot of things can happen that create jobs above and beyond the jobs that are actually incentivized directly by the program. And this 2.5 estimate, it sounds big, but there's other research, and I cite it in the paper, which I think gets circulated. If it doesn't, we can get it to you. There's other research with very different programs, different approaches, trying to estimate what we call local multipliers. That is, when one job gets created locally, how many other jobs does it create? And we're a little higher than that, but we're not extraordinarily high. We are extraordinarily high, or CCTC is extraordinarily high, relative to other kinds of place-based policy programs or job creation incentive programs. And that's the sense in which our conclusion at this point is it looks very successful. Now, I want to clarify one other thing. When I say 2.5, that's the multiplier in the tract. That doesn't necessarily mean 2.5 jobs are being created statewide for every job that CCT subsidizes. You can tell stories why it might be a little bigger if there's spillovers to other tracts. You can tell stories why it might be a little smaller if some of the job growth occurs in the place where jobs were incentivized instead of somewhere else in the state. And that's a very hard question to answer. However, the structure of the CCTC program makes that relatively unlikely, that there's the latter, that you just move jobs from one place to another. And that's because of the discretion program officials have. And it's because of some of the things that are built into the program, like it's easier to award the incentives, or there's a priority for awarding incentives if you are going to move to California, or if you might have moved out of California absent the credit. So again, the program was designed in a smart way to try to avoid just moving jobs around within the state, which still might be useful if you're moving into just less advantaged areas, but isn't as useful for overall job creation. The other surprising, 2 other points here. One is the awards are, in terms of, we look at neighborhoods divided by income and divided by education, just kind of above and below median. By income, the awards are creating jobs roughly proportionally to the number of jobs that already exist in those kind of neighborhoods. They're not favoring high income neighborhoods, but neither are they particularly targeting low income neighborhoods. Kind of balanced. With respect to education, which predicts income, maybe it's less important on its own. The awards are actually a little tilted towards higher education than lower education tracts. So there is potential scope for saying we should target this to less advantaged places more than we do. There is some targeting built in the program. That's hard to do because the award is given for creating a job, not for creating a job for somebody who lives there. Because that would be sort of a nightmare to try to administer. Not that we would want to do that. So we could improve targeting. whether it would decrease the efficiency of the program is an open question. And the second thing, the last thing I want to say before I plunge into some more details is that, and this was a bit surprising until we looked at the data more, the usual story is create manufacturing jobs and that creates other jobs. Well, it turns out that the spillover effects are driven by CCTC incentives given to non-manufacturing firms, not to manufacturing firms. And one reason for that is because the view that manufacturing jobs are what we call tradable, that is, you produce stuff here and sell it all over the place, and non-manufacturing jobs aren't. So it's like restaurants and dry cleaners. So if you create a job here, it just creates a job here. That's not really true anymore. There's a lot of non-manufacturing industries that trade a lot of stuff. Think like software or accounting services or consulting services. And we discuss this in the paper. So that result is less surprising when you sort of think about what the economy looks like right now. Okay, so let me let me dive in. CCTC, I think, more or less replaced California's enterprise zone program in 2014. I don't know if the link was that explicit, but the enterprise zone program was killed, and then the CCTC program was created. That was based, I think, on strong evidence to which Jed Kolko and I and others contributed, that California's enterprise zone program was not doing much of anything. It was mainly creating windfalls for existing firms. And if you dug into the structure, and we discussed this in our older work, Jed Kolko and I, if you dug into the structure of the program, what was going on, you could really see why you were getting all these windfalls, because you could even claim these credits retroactively for something you did 4 years ago, which is not a very sensible way to incentivize the creation of new jobs. CCTC tried to really deal with all those things. The discretion was an important part. You didn't just get the credit because you hired somebody in some location. There were a lot of strategic considerations. Where were those jobs valuable? How much were they paying? As well as the thing that's hardest to figure out, but the program administrators seem to be doing this to some extent, figuring out where these jobs would not have been created absent the incentive. And that's not easy to do because businesses have every reason to tell you they're not going to create the jobs unless you give them the money. And you got to kind of figure out, are they pulling our leg or not? And that's important. And most existing programs don't have that. How does it work? Any business that might locate or grow in California can apply for the credits. There's a two-stage process. Your application indicates costs, how much you're asking for, and benefits in terms of payroll and investment. Think of those as a ratio. You can rank order them, right? Lowest to highest, and low is good here because low is costs over benefits, right? And then they take the amount allocated in the budget for that phase of applications, and there's 3 of those per year. And if you're below double the threshold, then you sort of move on to the second stage. So what's cool about this is you're scored in sort of a fairly mechanical way, but employers or companies can't really game this because they don't know who else is going to apply and how much they're going to ask for. They don't know where the cutoff is going to be, right? And then you get beyond the cutoff, and then there's a discretionary evaluation, further negotiation, and basically a contract gets written. And if businesses are approved, they have 5 years to meet the milestones, or the milestones are defined in terms of FTE, full-time employment, full-time equivalent employment, salary levels, and project investment, and they get the credits over time. That's sort of how it's set up. There's some other details I'll get into. I'm going to skip though because there's a lot of those. Let me just look at my notes and see where I want to jump to. Okay, I'll jump to here. Roughly 150 to 200 million per year available. There's 3 rounds per year. The credits tend to be pretty large. The average winning applicant got it by 865,000. About 20% get more than $1 million. In earlier years, this ended, I think, in 2018. There's 1,000,001 details here. There was a set aside for small businesses where that cutoff in the first stage really didn't apply because there weren't many applicants. As I said, any business can apply as long as you're located or expanding in California. Where's the place-based flavor? If you're going to create, I won't give the details, but basically more jobs in higher unemployment, higher poverty areas, you can get priority in review. And if that's the best way to say this, if you can make the case and convince the program administrators that absent the credit, your activity, i.e. your hiring and or investment, is going to occur in another state, either because you're going to open another branch there, or you're going to move there, or you're not going to come here unless you get the credit, there's what's called automatic advancement. You can sort of get to the second discretionary stage. So all of these things are important because this is where the discretion comes in. It sounds formulaic, but it's not. There's sort of rules that get you, further consideration. But at the end of the day, the program administrators are really trying to figure this out. I don't envy them. It's not an easy task. The question at hand is, does it work? And that's what we're doing, because when people like me who've studied place-based policy say you really need discretion because you got to figure out where these incentives are actually going to lead to new jobs being created. So that's a great idea. But of course, once you say discretion plays a role, then the question is, how wisely is that discretion being applied? And if it's being applied really badly, the program's not going to be effective. There's a sense then in which our results are in principle generalizable to other states. They could copy California's program based on our evidence. They'd create some jobs if they did that. But it also depends on continuing to have good administrators exercising discretion in a way that actually identifies firms creating new jobs. And that's not always the case, it's not necessarily the case. So you probably have to look at these on a state-by-state basis. There were some changes in 2018, which are discussed in the paper, getting rid of the set aside for small businesses, some other factors that could get you priority, but I won't get into those because time. You have limited time. I think I covered all this, so I will plunge into the data. So we have data on all the applicants since the program's inception. We have all the details from their applications, their proposed job creation, these scores, which are the cost and benefit numbers, and you can kind of track their progression through the review process. As I said, we signed confidentiality agreements to protect the data and, of course, the businesses, although there is some public information about them. And importantly, GOBIS has no control. And then we use the track level HCS data, as I mentioned. The sample we actually use, the data is not a sample, it's everybody. 2013 to 2018, we wanted to have some time on these census tracts before any incentives take place. And we have about 2 years. And in some cases, up to 5 years after. Obviously, if you got the incentive in 2018, we don't have data on 5 years after. But for the earlier awardees, we study the tracts where somebody applied for a credit. If no one ever applied, you're not in our data because we can't do anything with those. They're not very interesting. And these would typically be tracts with very little commercial activity. They're purely residential tracts, which could be urban or rural. But with this next to no business activity, at least as indicated by the fact that nobody applied for a CCTC credit. So as I said, the basic empirical approach in a little more detail is to compare changes in outcomes in tracts where more jobs were awarded to tracts where fewer jobs were awarded. And in evaluating the effect of policy, you always face the problem of what we call the counterfactual. What is a counterfactual? The counterfactual is the thing you can't see. Because, right, if a tract got awarded credits, what you really want to know is what would have happened in that exact same place at that exact same time if the tract didn't get the credits. Well, obviously, you can't observe both of those things because they did get the credits. So the trick in empirical research of evaluating policy is always to say, what is a good approximation or good estimate of what would have happened in that tract had they not got the credits? And that's the counterfactual. It's what would have happened otherwise. That's a layman's translation of counterfactual. So maybe they awarded that a lot of incentives where places were booming, and then we'd overestimate the beneficial effects of the program. Or maybe they said we should help they being the administrators said, oh, we should really help the places that are doing badly, that are on a downward trajectory. And it might still help them, but they might still keep doing worse, just not as bad as they would have had they not gotten the awards. But if they're sort of on a negative trajectory, we're going to underestimate them. So that's why you want to compare like tracts. As I said, we do that in two ways: by comparing tracts with, let's say, 100 jobs awarded to tracts with 100 jobs applied for but not awarded. So there's a similar demand for credits, or even looking at tracts where the applicants rejected or not, we're very close to each other in terms of this cost benefit ratio. So not only was there similar demand for credits, but the kind of conditions, what they were asking for in return, what they would deliver in terms of jobs and investment looked kind of the same. And the idea there is we would love, if I was a researcher and got at the same time, and those are not the same thing, I'd love to just randomly assign these. I'd say, randomly drop these credits on different places and see what happens. Well, that's not going to happen because you can't do random assignment. public policy. But the idea of looking at the firms that are really close to either side of the cutoff is the variation you get whether or not you actually had jobs incentivized through CCTC awards is close to random or almost as good as random. So it's not like you're comparing tracks where the scores are really far apart, but they were really close together. This has a flavor for the grad students in the room, if there aren't any, usually are these talks, of regression discontinuity, what's we call regression discontinuity, RD. It's not quite the same thing, and that's because you can't really implement it here, but it's the same intuition. The rest of it. Okay, so what do we do here? Don't worry too much about the equation, but basically we're estimating the effects on Y, which is going to be employment in a tract in a year, as measured in the ACS. The variable we care about most, I guess I can do this for pointers, real pointers, because there's no slideshow in front of you. We care about this effect right here, which is what happens when a certain number of jobs are awarded incentives. This is our control for how many were proposed but rejected, and that's to make the comparison more between likes and likes. And then there's some other controls here, which is sort of control for other differences between the tracks that might matter that you don't need to worry about. As we're interested in beta, this guy right here, a beta of 0 would mean you don't create any jobs. Pure windfall, right? Incentives are being awarded to some tracks, not to others, has no effect on jobs. The companies that get the credits are happy, right? Because they get tax credits, but it had no effect. An estimate between 0 and 1 would be good, right? You're still creating some jobs. Some windfalls, maybe you don't create a job for every job you incentivize. Maybe you create, half a job or 0.6 jobs. That would still be better, and in fact, way better than a lot of job creation programs that don't create any jobs, right? And if you're greater than 1, which as I told you we are, it implies there's a positive multiplier. So for every job for which incentives are awarded, more than 1 job gets created. And it turns out, as I indicated earlier, to be about 2.5 jobs. Okay, let me just show you some, I'm going to just go through some numbers here and just kind of highlight things. We don't need to go through all the details. This is just some descriptives. This is by year. So you can see in 2013, they're jobs awarded, jobs proposed. They're 0 because the program didn't exist. It starts in 2014 at a small scale. And then you can see as you come out in the years, you start to get up to around 30, 40 in the latter few years. That's the number of jobs awarded per tract, okay, with any applicants. Not a huge number, but that's the average per tract, right? There's more proposed than are awarded. You can see these numbers are bigger here. If conditional on an award being given, because this can sometimes be zeros, it's actually closer to 100. Across all years, 75. In the last year, about 100. About 100 jobs awarded per tract. And you may say that's not a very big number, 100 jobs. Well, employment in these tracts is only around 4,800, right? So it's 100 on that number, which is a reasonable percentage. This is not a huge program, right? We're not spending a fortune on this program. You shouldn't, you in fact, and I'll come back later and tell you what this implies, cost per job created based on our estimate. It's pretty favorable. So this is actually a decent number of jobs awarded. Okay, what actually happens? So that's just descriptive statistics. This table is basically the estimates of that gnarly equation I showed you before. If you just look at this column, what this would imply is 4 jobs are created for every job that CCTC incentivizes. But this doesn't include this control for jobs proposed. So you're not looking at jobs at tracks that are similar to each other. We really care about this column, and this column's almost the same, so it doesn't matter that much. So let's jump to this one. Here we control for the number of jobs that were proposed, right? But they weren't necessarily awarded. And you can see that estimate is positive. Now, that's not an effect of the policy, let me be clear. That just means places where more businesses were applying for jobs or businesses were applying for more jobs to be incentivized actually grew faster subsequently. Now that's not surprising because you have to remember this credit gets. I didn't say this actually. I should have. I meant to. If you promise to create jobs and don't, they come back. They get the credits back, right? So you don't really want to promise jobs here and not deliver. It happens sometimes because stuff happens like COVID, right? Or just bad outcomes for your firm. But in general, more applications for jobs come from places that are doing better. But this is really controlled. This is the number we care about. And I said 2.5. This one's 2.7. It changes a little later. But this number right here is per job awarded, which is what this variable is. How many jobs get created? And you can see it's a little over 2.5. That's sort of the baseline estimate. This is the table that breaks it out by whether the tracts we're looking at are lower income or higher income, and it's below or above median, so you're either one or the other, or lower education, higher education, again, above or below median for tracts. And you can see here that the effect is bigger in higher income tracts compared to here. And the effect is bigger in higher education tracts compared to here, which looks pretty unfavorable if you're trying to help less advantaged areas. But you have to remember there's lower employment in the less advantaged tracts. And you can see right here the ratio of employment in lower income tracts to high income tracts is about 3/4, 0.75, about the same as the ratio here. So the jobs are getting created in higher versus lower income tracts, roughly in proportion to the jobs that already exist. So it's kind of neither favoring or disfavoring high income or lower income tracts. You might say, perfectly legitimate, that's not good. We should be doing more to favor lower income tracts. And that's something policymakers can discuss. With respect to education, the difference in effects is somewhat bigger. And actually that ratio is somewhat smaller. But if you do the math, this is actually somewhat disproportionately favoring higher education tracts. Not as much as these estimates suggest, because you kind of want to multiply this number by this number if you want to follow through all the details. But still, the program is to some extent creating relatively more jobs in higher education tracts. And that's a common, and there's this common problem in any policy where you try to create jobs based on location, that firms don't have to hire a local worker. Now you could in principle require that for the policy. You could in principle require that you hire a poor person. That's a really hard thing to do because we don't have ID cards that say we're poor or records that say we're poor. But it is a problem. And this is something, I mean, what could you do? GoBiz, for example, could give even higher priority to lower SES, lower education, lower income areas. Again, if they hired from outside, this might still happen. But that's something that could potentially be experimented with. But I think the important point, I mean, this income is what we care about most, right? I think from a poverty perspective. And the fact that they're proportional, roughly, to the number of jobs there is actually a pretty good outcome. We're not, in terms of income, this policy is not actually favoring, at least on a relative basis, the high income areas. So that's let's call it pretty good. Maybe it could be better. Okay. Manufacturer, non-manufacturer. I'll leave a couple more slides that I want to touch on. Excuse me. So here we estimate the total effects, but now we break up both the awarded jobs, you can see it here, and the proposed jobs into manufacturing and non-manufacturing. That's the traditional manufacturing definition. And what you can see here is the effect is coming from non-manufacturing jobs. Okay, which surprised us at first because the usual story is it's the manufacturing jobs that create spillovers. And then when you break it up and look at manufacturing employment and non-manufacturing employment, again, you see it's really the non-manufacturing jobs creating spillovers in other, well, either in the same firm or other firms, but creating, leading to the creation of more non-manufacturing jobs in the same area. Now, again, let me just touch on what I said before. It was surprising to us until we dug into it more, and two things. One is, as I said, the manufacturer, non-manufacturing distinction in terms of what we call tradable and non-tradable sectors is not nearly as hard and fast as it used to be. Yeah, restaurants are non-tradable, but lots of non-manufacturing firms and businesses are in fact tradable. So they could create a lot of spillovers. Second, and conversations with GoBiz, and this is where our ability to ask them a lot of questions, not to say here's our regressions, was helpful. Indicated on the manufacturing side, they often awarded credits for sort of pretty high-end R&D type jobs in companies related to manufacturing. And you could say, well, that's really not, for the point of view of reducing inequality or whatever, that may not be a good thing. And the sort of the immediate effect is not. I mean, it's like jobs for engineers and stuff. But two things: those jobs may not create local spillover. So I might fund R&D research somewhere in Silicon Valley, but maybe as a result, a plant gets built somewhere out in the Central Valley. Well, you're not going to see those jobs spilling over in the tract where the jobs are subsidized, but it might be happening somewhere else in the state. And different perspective, not really capturing these regressions. I think the state clearly has an interest in keeping high income jobs here because high income people, pay a lot of taxes and they're good for the tax base, even more so in a state like California, which has very progressive taxation. So, we don't see the same spillovers in manufacturing, but I think the program details help, and some issues about the data help explain why. And it doesn't really matter because we're still finding the program creates jobs, but that is a bit of a puzzle relative to, I think, what classic economic development teaches us. But it definitely seems to be the case here. Okay, the last thing we do, and I just want to show you this graph in one table, is we might talk about this rate, this score, this cost over benefit score, right? And if you're low, you're good, right? Because you're not asking for that much, and you're going to deliver a lot. Although GOBIS, when you talk to the folks who work there, they tell you if your score looks ridiculously good, like you can deliver massive benefits for almost no credit, they just don't believe, right? And that may be right. But what we do here is focus on the tracks where applicants, whether or not they were awarded, were really close to the cutoff score for each phase. And we basically reweight the data. And the interesting one is this one here, this line that goes sort of like a hockey stick, I guess, depending on which way you lay it. We have almost no weight on tracks where the scores are far apart, and almost all the weight on the tracks really nearby. And that's where you're getting closer to the mimicking, even though it's not really, but mimicking the idea that these things were awarded randomly, which I know they aren't really. Before the GOBIS folks get nervous. I say they're awarded randomly, they're not, but these are the firms, these are sort of the applicants for whom it would have been a tough choice because their applications, at least, initially looked very similar. And when you do that, I'm going to just show you which one is it? I remember which one it is. This one. When you do that, I realize I can't flip back and forth here. These are the estimates you get, and they look really similar to what we had before. It really doesn't change. Here's the 2.5, 2.6 multiplier, low income, high income tracks, low ed, high ed tracks. Most of the jobs being created in non-manufacturing by non-manufacturing spillovers. So that's nice because often empirical research results are fragile. They change a lot if you do different sensible things with the data, and then you don't really know what you have. And that's just the nature of, sometimes that's the way the research comes out. And you have to just say, it's hard to tell. And that's definitely happened to me a lot of times in my research. Here, the answer seems very robust. You can sort of beat up the data any old sensible way, and you kind of get the same answer. So it makes me believe it more, and hopefully it encourages you to believe it more. So let me just finish and a bit of summary and discussion. So the results point to significant local multipliers. We create more jobs than we incentivize with this program. Roughly proportionate across high and low income tracts, and really the action is coming from non-manufacturing. Not clear that the 2.5 is the state number, right? We might be creating somewhat more jobs at the state level. We might be creating less jobs if jobs shift, but we speculate, and I want to emphasize that, speculate that there isn't a lot of the shifting relative to other programs like enterprise zones, where we know from people who have studied this, there's a ton of shifting because there's no discretion there. You create a job in an area, you get the incentive, so why not move? Or deciding where to open a restaurant, open it in the enterprise zone track, even though you would have done anyways. Okay, a bit on total numbers. I promised you this. At the time of writing this paper, which at this point was around 7 months ago, I guess, CCT program had spent around $1.23 billion. Pledged jobs by awarded businesses. Sorry, my timer's going off, so I'll turn that off and stop it in 1 minute. Pledged jobs awarded was around 124,000, implying a direct cost per incentivized job of 9,900. Now, in fact, not all jobs were delivered, and we discussed that in the paper. Some firms sort of weren't meeting their goals. There's more detail in the paper. But if we take that number and then we apply the multiplier, the 2.5, we get a number of around $4,000 per jobs created. That's actually, relative to the literature, a very favorable number. If you look at enterprise zones, because almost no jobs get created, the cost per job is almost infinite. The Neumark tax credit, which Matt Friedman, my co-author, studied, finds some positive effects, but higher cost per job. Other hiring credit programs, even more. And the earned income tax credit, which I love for other reasons, and I've discussed it in this very forum, per job created costs a fortune, but it has a lot of other things, partly because it's very distributionally focused on low-income people. It's not really a job creation program. It's an income distribution program that works partly through creating jobs. So the evidence so far, this points to a success story. And this is where I want to remind you that CCTC GOBIS had no say in what we say. I could have said, this bullet could have said, the CCTC is a complete failure, and you'd be hearing the same presentation. Well, not the same results, but you'd be hearing a presentation about the CCTC. There is this question of whether we'd want to change the structure somewhat to target less advantaged areas. That might come with a trade-off of fewer jobs created per dollar spent. That also might be okay if we prefer those distributional outcomes. If I told you I have a policy, it's going to reduce the multiplier to 1.8, but a high share of jobs are going to go to low-income areas, you might say, I'll take that trade-off because I care about reducing inequality. That's a policy choice. We'd have to obviously evaluate the policy. We would know for sure. And I'm looking behind my camera to see what the last bullet says. Oh, right. And the only other thing I want to say is we will have more evidence on this later. The later is a little ambiguous, probably about a year. And if there's a government shutdown, longer, because then we can't use the census data. But we are doing research using this data is data on households and where they live and where they work, focusing on where they work. We have research underway now. I cannot say what the results are because it's confidential data and the census hasn't approved it yet. But we are studying confidential data on businesses and where we can actually identify the businesses that got awards, the businesses that didn't get awards, but are near geographically the businesses that did. And we can look for effects in the business data. And with those data, partly replicate what we're finding here, presumably, we'll find out, but partly also learn more about the underlying mechanism. And do jobs get created at the same firm? Do they get created at different firms? Whatever the case might be. So I will stop there and take questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Neumark, for just a fantastic talk today. Let me go ahead and just stop our recording.